Okay, thank you very much for joining us tonight. We're talking to Mr. Evan Drellich about his new book, Winning Fixes Everything, how baseball's brightest minds created sports' biggest mess. Glad you're joining us tonight here at the Dearborn Library. Just want to give you a quick heads up, couple things. We'll be talking with Mr. Drellich for about 25, maybe 30 minutes, and then we'll have a short Q&A, maybe about 5-10 minutes. So get your questions ready. And just want to give you an announcement about an upcoming program. We'll be talking next Tuesday with Mr. Alex Prudhomme about his great book, Dinner with the President. So at 6:30, so please join us at that time. So I'm very excited to be talking with Mr. Drellich. He's a senior writer with The Athletic. He has experience. Was a beat writer for the Houston Astros and the Boston Red Sox. We can talk to him about that for a couple minutes. So I want to thank you, Evan, for joining us tonight. I always like to ask people that I talk to, it's because it may bring out some certain questions. Did you always want to be a sports writer when you grew up?
I was baseball obsessed in high school. It was really kind of, I think back to that period, it was maybe the top identifiable quality about me was that I was a Mets fan. And this is the late 90s, early 2000s in New York City. So everybody else is a Yankees fan. And in high school, I started writing a blog about the Mets. And then I got to college, and my father had encouraged me to go to the student newspaper and see if I could write there. And I walked in the student paper and I said, I'd like to write about the Mets. And they said, and this is a school in New York, the sports editor at the time said, well, we don't really do that, but if you'd like to cover the lacrosse team or the soccer team, you're welcome to do that. And so I did that. And so the love of baseball brought me to reporting and to journalism. And then as I did more and more reporting and journalism, I fell in love with the reporting aspect of it. That fandom slinks away, at least in the form that it existed in childhood. You don't root for a team anymore at my stage of the game, but that was the progression. It started with a love of baseball and then evolved to a love for reporting.
Now, you were the beat writer for the Boston Red Sox and also the Houston Astros. You worked for many years at the Chronicle there in Houston, and it kind of fits in with the story that you wrote about.
Yeah, I had actually covered the Red Sox twice. I was in Boston right before I went to Houston, and then I actually ended up leaving Houston to go back to Boston on the feeling that there'd simply be more career opportunity in such a sports crazy, larger media market town like Boston. It does end up being the case that, among the teams that break baseball's rules, the Red Sox and Astros were two of them. I and my colleague at The Athletic, Ken Rosenthal, ended up leading the reporting about both of those teams and their cheating. But particularly the time at the Chronicle in Houston, this book that I've done, it's really 10 years of my reporting career. It goes back to right when I started in Houston. And right when I started in Houston, there were questions that I kept hearing about the way the Astros were run, their management culture, how they were treating people. And I wrote a story my first season on the beat in Houston in 2014, presenting those criticisms and questions. And I think if I ever have an obituary, there'll be probably a sentence about, well, he's one of the reporters who broke the Astros sign stealing scandal. I actually think in a way that story I did in 2014 about the Astros management culture, if it's not more important, it was just as important, because it really starts a snowball effect in my reporting career where people start to trust me and see that I'm willing to write hard and difficult stories, but if they're real and if there are real things to write about.
Now, I read and also preparation. I also read Moneyball. We read it to prepare for the talk, and I'm still analytics. Every team has one. Tigers included. Everyone has a staff, I'm still, maybe I'm a little old-fashioned, but I still. And I wanted to set the game for people who might not know, listeners might not know. What kind of analytics do teams depend on, or what they look at now?
Yeah, it's really grown. I think it's safe to say, without too much exaggeration, exponentially. So when Moneyball is written and comes out, it's either I think it came out in 2003. If it wasn't 03, it was 04.
Right.
And it's about the 2002 A's, and really the story of that team is, well, they're trying to win games with a relatively low payroll, and so how do they find advantages other than money? And they're doing it with kind of what we would now look at as basic statistical innovations, realizing that things like walks are more valuable than people realize, and that they should be included in their assessments of players, and that college players in the draft might be a safer pick than high school players. What ends up happening is baseball, like many industries, is a copycat industry, and all these other owners look at what the A's are able to do and go, well, why can't we do this? Why, I want to win more cheaply. I don't want to spend top dollar if I can avoid it. And so steadily teams build out their own departments, some more quickly and better than others. And you arrive at a point today where the technology has advanced so far, they can measure and do measure the attributes of a single pitch, the spin rate. There are sensors that they can use for hitting. They have really granular information now about the performance on the field, and as well, statistics that they think objectively express players' true value, well beyond the standards of runs, hits, batting average, and RBIs.
Now that when you're talking about statistics, that kind of thought came to my mind that may have attracted people that came to the Astros because of their background. They had one guy was involved in financial derivatives. Another guy was an engineer. All that's kind of it appealed to them, finding these little niches, finding these little avenues where they can say, oh, why don't we try this or do this?
Yeah, baseball prior to Moneyball was really an insular place. It still is insular, but Moneyball opens the gates for a ton of people, for people with mathematical skills, fantasy players who might actually also have managerial skills. And it brings in this new wave. Really, what it ended up being is a lot of Ivy League people, and it creates innovation in the sport. It was innovation that was probably inevitably going to happen at some point, needed to happen. It's not as though the arrival of advanced numbers and analytics and statistics unto itself was a bad thing, but there is an outgrowth here that when you bring in all these new people, there's a clashing between the old guard and the new guard. And, in a way, the sport becomes, even now today, insular in a different way. And there can be groupthink on the other end of the spectrum. And, numbers aren't perfect, and people can rely on them improperly or too much. And but it does all tie back to Moneyball. The Michael Lewis book and the story of that Oakland team sets off this wave of change that's really still flowing and evolving in the sport.
The University of Michigan actually has a program in sports management. So for anybody who may be listening there, and they're just reading this book was like people could do term papers on what went wrong or what was so bad, because yeah, you're right. probably should start Jeffrey Luno, essentially the villain, what you call the villain of the piece. He had a background, I believe was, correct me if I'm wrong, financial derivatives.
Yeah, the person who had the derivatives background specifically was actually a person he later hires named Brandon Taubman, who becomes the assistant general manager. So Jeff Luno, the GM of the team, is a McKinsey consultant who then, right around 2000, goes to the Bay Area and joins tech startups. He actually was working at a petstore.com, which, you know, ends up being part of the famous implosion of that bubble back then. But, you know, he's got this really glamorous conventional resume, Northwestern and Penn degrees from both of their economics, engineering background, smart guy. And he was an excellent fantasy baseball player, but he had no avenue to get into the sport. He loved baseball. Moneyball is written, is published, and then through a connection Luno has via McKinsey, the owner of the St. Louis Cardinals, you know, asked to talk to him, and the Cardinals end up bringing in Luno. They set out on a change management program. They're trying to change the way the Cardinals do things. It was very rocky. It wasn't they didn't kind of think out, well, all right, if we're going to make these changes, how do we do it so that we can keep some stability and avoid infighting? And, you know, this experience kind of hardens Luno's resolve. But in the areas that Luno has control over in his time in St. Louis, namely the amateur draft and the farm system, they do very well. And eventually, about 6-7 years later, the Houston Astros need a general manager, and they have this owner from the outside, Jim Crane, who made his money in logistics and, you know, trucking, moving things from point A to point B. And Crane hires Luno. So Luno is very much an example of one of these outsiders who arrives in the sport post Moneyball, and I think himself wanted to subsequently change the game and have a similar narrative around him, you know, that he was going to take this a step further and be remembered as somebody who had changed the game.
Yeah, I remember a comment, high up manager in the Cardinals office gave up an actual office for a cubicle because he didn't want to share a wall with him.
There was a lot of drama in St. Louis because, you know, members of the old guard looked at him poorly, and Luno, very smart guy, didn't always have the best tact. And yeah, there was somebody who didn't want to share a wall with him. There was another story where Luno is told by the fellow who's now the Cardinals president of baseball operations, John Mozeliak, to not come into the office because one of the other Cardinals executives had threatened to kick his rear end, and I'm using a more gentle word, if he showed up that day. And Luno did indeed stay home. So there was a lot of drama in St. Louis, and Luno had kind of ascended as far as he was going to get. He was never going to get full control in St. Louis, but listen, you don't leave the McKinsey, the .com startup tech world, arrive in baseball if you don't have aspirations, typically, of getting to the top. And Luno certainly wanted to get to the top.
Yeah, so he got that chance in Houston with Jim Crane, and he brings, like together like Brandon Taubman, like you said, Sig McDowell, who worked with him in the St. Louis. Sig, he worked in NASA. Another, like an engineer who could eventually, who had a hobby of notice how pitches through or how pitches develop to the plate, looking at and applying the science to that. All these different people, my point is all these different people, and it's like, how can you bring them under one roof, bring them under, and it worked out. It was chaos. It was, he really didn't try or wasn't able to bring together everyone. It was just everybody for themselves.
You know, one of the first time I I was an English major, and as I explained, I came into my role because I loved baseball. I've never myself run a business. The first time I had ever heard the term change management, I believe, was actually from Jeff Luhnow himself. And the Astros eventually became more conscious of the need for when you are implementing change to create buy-in, but particularly in those early years, there were very minimal efforts to do so. They cleaned house, fired a lot of people, which when you have a change program can be something that turns people off. It can be hard for people to innovate in a setting like that where everybody's getting axed left and right next to you. But Jeff Luhnow, after having had kind of a rocky experience in St. Louis, Jim Crane, who has his own controversial background and had been criticized and had negative things written about him in the press, and deservedly so, before buying the team, both were very convinced of really their own self-righteousness and the plan that they had put in place. And for a group that was so kind of keen to challenge convention in the sport, they weren't particularly receptive to anyone else's criticisms or suggestions about their own plans. And over time, the Astros front office actually grows more and more insular, and they start acting more and more boldly, and really start making more and more, frankly, fatal errors because of the whole front office. Luhnow and others get cleaned out, years later when you have this massive scandal that unfolds. So the notion of buy-in is an important one. And, how do you implement and properly make change in any organization?
Yeah, you're right. People, they were creating statistical models to say, match this relief pitcher is great against this hitter, and was trying to influence in-game managerial decisions. They're all dependent on numbers, dependent on models, and models don't work all the time. Numbers don't work all the time.
Yeah, and a lot of the stuff that the core approach that the Astros had in a pure baseball sense, they were right about a lot of stuff. They were smart. These weren't dummies that they brought in to run their baseball team. But if you are the smartest front office around and you can't get the players, the agents, even some of your own staff to trust you, well, what good does it do you? And so it's really this question of implementation. And you can be innovative and really smart, and I think do a better job of bringing people along with you. I ended up speaking to a Harvard Business School professor who's basically made a career out of studying change management, and his point is that when change really successfully happens, it is not a group of a few people, the quote unquote smartest guys in the room, dictating to everybody else. It's about bringing people along with you, making them see and feel and grab on to what you want to do. And the Astros really struggled with that. They got better at it in some ways over time, but it was pretty ugly in the early years.
Well, yeah, I find in doing these programs, listening is a great thing. It's a superpower. If people are understood or people are heard, then they'll run miles for you. It's a remarkable thing. And yeah, like I was just making a note how they wanted to sign a draftee in 2014, Brandy Aiken, and they messed around with they were valid in their concerns about his elbow, but they messed around so much that it really didn't dispel everybody's notions that they were up to no good.
Yeah, and it's a good example to bring up because you can sit there and go, well, look, if what they're doing is smart, aren't they going to get the end result that they want in the end? And to an extent, this is true. The Astros do get the end result that they want. They build a strong roster, but in a situation, this was a complicated situation where they had the #1 overall draft pick. Draft picks in baseball do not have to go for medical exams until after they're drafted. And lo and behold, after he's drafted, the Astros see something that makes him uncomfortable, and it becomes this protracted negotiation over, are we going to sign him? If we're going to sign him, for how much? And the kid and his family really felt, he's fine. And there were some other complicating factors, but basically the ill will that the Astros had engendered with all the other things they were doing in those early years didn't help them at a time when, otherwise they might have received the benefit of the doubt. And, the Astros, in hindsight, it seems certainly did properly evaluate the kid's arm, that it was something of a ticking time bomb, and it was too bad, but nobody trusted them. And it's a good example of where that lack of buy-in that they didn't create comes back to bite you, because this is a very public undertaking and an event, and everybody looked at the Astros really skeptically, thought they were trying to screw the kid and leverage him into taking a lower deal, when, at the end of the day, they probably did get the medicals right.
So yeah, all this chaos and dependence on statistics, and Luna wasn't the grit. He really didn't, and I think McKenzie pointed that out in one of their evaluations, that he really didn't give credit to the people at the right time. So it was like a win it all. Look at me, and those kinds of things lead to the cheating scandal, where they are use the trash cans in the video rooms to steal other teams' signs.
Yeah, this is really kind of at the heart of what I set out to do with my book. Is, I think a lot of people listening would know, yes, the Astros had this massive cheating scandal. The book set out to explain, well, how did we get there? And having covered the team, I understood, and then subsequently reported even more when I set out to do the book. I understood that this wasn't kind of this coincidental, one-off, accidental event. That there were a lot of factors that would lead to the Astros being a team that would egregiously break the rules, as they did. And when Jeff Luhnow gets to Houston, there's a famous anecdote that he liked to tell. He was a pretty media savvy guy. He loved positive media attention. That right as he's taking over, he asks the owner, Jim Crane, what are my constraints? What are my restrictions here? And Crane passes him a blank sheet of paper, and the message is very clear. There are no constraints, right? That this is your oyster. Do it the way it should be done. Build it in this ideal vision. And again, the core baseball evaluation stuff, they did a good job with that. It's everything that they didn't pay attention to: buy-in, ethics, compliance. It was a very bottom line driven operation. Win baseball games, make money. A lot of businesses probably operate this way, but this is an extreme example of what can go wrong when you don't pay attention to any of the other factors. And it's really the stuff that the Astros didn't care about that ends up doing them in. And, it becomes a natural progression of, we have to innovate. We have to keep innovating. We got to be better. We got to be better. We got to beat the other teams. That you arrive at a point where they look around and go, all right, well, we'll start cheating.
Well, I was going to say, you kind of hint at how other teams were not specific. Well, the Red Sox, it's been dictated, and they got in trouble for doing that. But you kind of hint at how other teams are kind of doing the same thing.
Yeah, and this is a complicated topic in a sense. Certainly, the Astros looked around and saw that other teams, they had players come over from other teams, that they knew, they had some sense that other teams were doing something underhanded, and what other teams were doing was using their video rooms to look at the catcher's signs and using that information basically in real time. So when a runner would get on second base, they could tell the hitter, this is what's coming. The Astros end up taking that scheme a step further. So they do the same thing, but they devise a system where you don't need a runner on base. You can communicate to the hitter what pitch is coming entirely off the field. They had a camera in center field. It was set up to a television monitor near the dugout where the players sit during the game. And didn't matter if somebody was on base. You could make a loud noise, bang a bat on a garbage can situated right near this television monitor, and that told the hitter what was coming. And, we watch sports for the competition on the field. And what the Astros did was create this system that was entirely electronic based off the field. It really kind of attacked the veracity of what people saw on the field. The Astros did use as a justification, and their fans still use as a justification, while other teams were doing something. So in understanding what happened, yes, that is part of the story. Whether other teams' wrongdoings justify your own becomes more of a philosophical debate. If you get pulled over for doing 120 and a 65, is it a valid argument to the police officer? Well, you didn't pull over this guy driving 90 in the 65. I think most people would look at that as an invalid argument, but there's a lot you can talk about with this question of, well, somebody else is doing something wrong. Does that allow me to do it too?
Now, especially here in Detroit, I got to ask about AJ Hinch. He's the current manager here at the Tigers. He, from what you described, he seemed like was a good guy. He's a good guy. He just, but I guess he's only human. They get caught up in all of this. What did people say to you?
There's no question that, and I think AJ has directly acknowledged this, that he essentially failed. It is his job to run the clubhouse and the dugout. And it's ultimately, you could say it's ultimately the owner's job, the general manager's job. He was one of the people who was responsible for making sure that rules are followed and that the team doesn't break the rules. It's his group of players, and he didn't do that. Now, why didn't he do that? Hinch had been a manager once before in Arizona before getting the Astros job. He gets fired in his second season in Arizona. He'd lost the clubhouse pretty quickly. Veterans didn't trust him. He was a young guy, came in from the front office. This is before younger managers kind of grew in vogue in the sport. And this is his second job in baseball. And you don't always get a third chance. The team is winning. There's a segment of the clubhouse that really believes in this cheating scheme and wants it to continue. And so Hinch kind of takes steps to halt it, tries, but never has a demonstrative in front of the whole team moment of, we're not doing this anymore. So he didn't want to lose his clubhouse. He didn't want to fight his bench coach or Carlos Beltran, who was in his final season, really powerful figure on the team. There's an element of fear, of insecurity, I think a bit of people pleasing that went on here. And look, it was a mistake. I think AJ Hinch brings a lot of strong qualities to a manager's role, but by his own account and by every other account, he didn't do what he should have in Houston, and it was, he didn't want to take on the fight with his group, and in hindsight, he should have.
Yeah, and they get so paranoid that in the 2018 postseason that they one of the staff gets in trouble for going to the Cleveland dugout or taking pictures of the Cleveland dugout because they think they're doing it. It's like it just expand and expand and expand.
Yeah, and this is where, if you talk to people on the coaching staff and the dugout, field staff people, they looked at that incident where there was this. He might have still been an intern. There was this lower level front office person who was going around to other teams' dugouts in the postseason taking pictures. And this was a counter espionage effort, allegedly. And I have no evidence otherwise, that the Astros were undertaking. They were trying to protect themselves from what other teams may or may not have been up to, and it blows up publicly. And it's actually a good example of one of these situations where, as far as I understand, that was not an initiative led by Hinch or the dugout. It was more of a front office thing. But who has to stand up there at the podium and deal with it in the middle of the postseason? Well, it's the manager. The manager sits there and answers the daily questions. Nobody else typically does that. And there were a lot of instances where the Astros would put their foot in their mouth in some way or another, in action or in words, and Hinch would have to deal with it. And there was distrust between a lot of factions in Houston. That includes Luhnow and Hinch. That doesn't mean they didn't work well together sometimes, but it was really kind of a fractured group. The players didn't trust the front office. When you don't have trust in an organization, well, how are you going to get to a point where somebody's going to come to the boss and say, hey, I need some help here. We got a cheating scheme. We got to stop this. Culturally, when you read the book, you see over time how, of course this was going to get out of hand. It was the wheels were greased over the years.
Just a couple more questions. A number of actually a whole lot of people that worked in the front office of the Astros at that time are working in other teams' front offices presently, like Stearns went to Milwaukee, Fass went to Atlanta, Pete, and correct me if I'm wrong, Patilla or something.
Patilla.
Went to the Giants. I wanted to ask you, is there, how are they doing, I guess, or is there a change or something? Are they bringing the same issues to those teams? Do you know?
Well, you'd have to go case by case, person by person. They all kind of contributed and had different roles. They were all smart people. And I think and believe that they learned a lot of lessons from what they saw and lived through under Jeff Luhnow. I'm not saying that they're all perfect, but Mike Fass, for example, basically quits in protest of how Luhnow's running his team in 2018. And Fass is somebody who he's now with Atlanta, as you say. He was a really unheralded member of the front office. Luhnow had done a very good job pushing a pretty narrow slice of the narrative around the team. He curated, and reporters ate it up, what the story of the Astros was. And there were some people who were really doing a lot of work, particularly in the later years, who had gotten, no visibility, no credit. And one of the striking things for me about the reporting process was how different the reality of the Astros and how they were run is and was from what the public understood and the narratives that have been previously put forth. It's a very easy thing to do when a team wins a World Series or any championship to write about how they're geniuses. In the case of the Astros, the story was they may be geniuses, but there's a lot of other stuff. And a lot of times the incentives aren't there for the reporters to go after that other stuff. In the case of the Astros, that other stuff ended up being really, really important. It's very difficult to know what really goes on in an organization, business, sports, any of them, without a lot of time and a lot of conversations and candid and frank conversations. And so I walk away from the book really, that sticks with me, how little we actually know sometimes, and how narratives can kind of get dragged along by a few people who want them to be dragged along in a certain way.
Yeah. Final question. With all this happening, with the scandals in the past, and then recently Commissioner Manfred said that analytics is an arm race to nowhere. What do you think is going to happen? Are the rules going to? They change rules for pitch clock. Why can't they change rules for cheating like this? Or what do you think the future will hold?
Yeah, they did take steps to make it much harder to steal signs electronically, to do an equivalent of what the Astros were doing. Now, if you remember, there was a rumor that Jose Altuve, star second baseman of the Astros, had used a buzzer.
Oh yeah.
My reporting did not find that, but one of the real injuries here of the cheating that went on is you start to distrust everything you're seeing, and you're going, well, if they're capable of this, what else are they capable of? And the reality is, unless you had a TSA style airport scanner before somebody goes to the plate, somebody could be wearing a buzzer. Technology is advanced to the point that you could put a little thing on your body and somebody could ping it, remotely. And, you hope the deterrent is, well, if you do that and you're caught, there's a huge punishment. But the history of baseball, the history of the outside world is that people will always try to get an edge, and some people are going to be willing to break a rule. I think the commissioner's office, in the wake of the Astros scandal, because the commissioner's office has culpability in a lot of this, they're the ones who provide these video tools to the teams that the Astros and others end up abusing. And they really weren't really thinking ahead about what could happen with these video tools. I think there's a little bit more conscientiousness now about what we have to do to kind of make sure teams aren't circumventing things. But rule breakers are almost always going to be ahead of enforcement, policing, inside or outside of baseball. So at some point, if it hasn't happened already, somebody's going to try to cheat again in some way. It is possible we will find out about it. It is possible we won't. I would imagine sometime in the next 50 years, there'll be some other major scandal in the sport. They seem to be, once every 20 years or so, something big happens. But people can also cheat in very smart ways. So cheating in sports is in no way gone. The specific form of cheating that the Astros undertook, I think it'd be unlikely we would see that again. But, people always have ideas.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to take a look here at the Q&A part. Let's see. Oh, interesting question. Hello from Boston. Love the book. You write a lot about how the analytics shift with the Astros started with TrackMan, but eventually more hitting related tech came to the forefront. Was there a noticeable difference in the way hitters perceived and thought about the tech changes versus the pitchers?
It's an interesting question. One of the issues with the hitting tech, certainly at the outset, was you'd have to, there was a knob that you would attach to a bat, and that's cumbersome. The Astros tried to give it to some players during batting practice, and they had more success because they had more control using it in the minor leagues. But it's simply easier to use pitching evaluation tools. TrackMan is this radar system that functions. It's a piece of equipment that gets to hang behind home plate off the field of play. Some of the hitting measurements, at least in the early going, were more invasive, and there were vests that people would wear. I'm trying to think of exactly what those vests accomplish. I'm blanking at the moment, but in general, for both hitters and pitchers, and it sounds like this person read the book, so they probably know this, but the Astros they really aggressively handled players in arbitration and with salary negotiations. Players didn't trust that the data the Astros would collect from these devices wouldn't be used against them. And it's something that's actually now ended up collectively bargained, where the Players Association, the union, has a say in how this technology is used and what teams can do with it. But the Astros, on one hand, were trying to screw players, and the same set of people in some instances were trying to say, here, no, use this new technology. We swear we won't use it against you. So but that's my instinct on the difference between hitters and pitchers, is that it was easier, less invasive to do pitcher measurements, at least at the outset. Yeah.
Okay. So let's take a look here. Okay. Have you found that your critical, honest reporting has affected your ability to nurture important sources in the sport?
It's a good question. I started talking at these early on about this story I did in 2014 about the management culture of the Astros, the one I said, might in a way be more important. That story, I was a little young, maybe a little naive. It was a story that I could clearly see was there, and I felt, well, this should be reported. And I had a kind of, I was an intern at Newsday, one of the New York papers. I'm a more aggressive reporter. That's my style in general. I think reporters should be asking hard questions. When I write that story, certainly the Astros front office does not like me. The high ups, Luno, Crane. So you could say it costs me in some way. What I've learned from that story and then many subsequently is that even if there's this hit with one party, if what you are reporting on is true and accurate and should be revealed, then the trust you gain from other people, from other stakeholders, from other sources, beats out whatever you lost. And there was a snowball effect for me of people realize that, he's not just going to sit there and regurgitate the company line like a lot of other people did and do. And, I'm really proud of the fact that I was kind of willing to take that step of, yeah, this is a real story and I'm going to report it. And, it's uncomfortable being disliked. The team tries to pressure you. The Astros literally tried to get me removed from my beat. The owner and the head spokesperson had a meeting with the editors of the Houston Chronicle, 2 editors of the Chronicle, to try to get me off the beat. Thankfully, the paper, and I believe rightly, stood by me. So yeah, look, when you're doing difficult, critical reporting, it's tough, and you have to have some mental fortitude. You have to make sure what you're doing is, accurate and right. But I do believe in the long run, what are sources? Sources are people who trust you. What builds trust? It is asking good questions and writing good stories and fair stories and showing that you're somebody worth talking to. And so that's my answer is, yes, there can be a hit that you take in some areas. You will gain more over time overall.
Okay, let's try one more question here. Take a look. Let's see, there's one up here. As a lifelong Mets fan, even if you don't need to conceal it these days, did it break your heart to see the firing of Carlos Beltran?
Yeah, my fandom does not. It's gone. I don't watch the Mets with any regularity. There's no rooting interest for me at this stage of my career. I'd answer this question generally, which is that the whole thing was weighty. When you have reporting that ends up leading to dismissals, you feel the weight of that. Now, I believe the reporting was fair and accurate, and it was. And at the end of the day, Carlos Beltran and everybody else involved, look, they did it to themselves. Yes, can I see the tragic side of the guy who was about to start his managerial career? Sure, absolutely. I understand that thinking. So it's weighty when there are consequences involved, but at the end of the day, they did this, and it's their responsibility to take and their accountability to take for what they did. And so, it's not like I'm proud of the reporting. You don't jump up and down, when people are losing their jobs. It's there are real life consequences to things. So it's complicated. There are layers to it. It's that's how I'd answer it.
Yeah, you wouldn't be human if it doesn't affect you in some way, but you keep you're there to report. You keep your distance.
Yes, and as a reporter, you are conscious of the impact your reporting can and does have on people. You can't always know exactly what that impact will be, but you try to assess that. And I put it this way. It's not as though if somebody had told me, Evan, if you write this story about the Astros cheating, people are going to get fired, that would have been a legitimate reason journalistically to not write the story. This was real. It happened. And I think it was important people understood what happened.
Yeah, definitely. So I want to thank you very much for joining us tonight. It's a great book. I would encourage people to purchase it anywhere. We have it outside of our auditorium if you want to pick up a copy, and probably at any bookstore, independent bookstore, wherever. So thank you very much, Evan. Great to have you, and good luck with the book. And he can be read he's doing great work at the Athletic. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Dan. Thank you everyone for listening. Really appreciate it.
Good night.